Undertale Fangames. You can hate them or you can love them, but there's one undeniable truth. They exist, and unfortunately some of them make the exact same mistake that generally kills my motivation to play them. This video will focus mainly on story-driven fangames, not games built around a single extremely difficult boss fight. So, the problem I'm talking about is the constant reuse of the same characters in the same roles as the main protagonists, sometimes with slightly altered sprites, sometimes with more edgy personality, but at the core it's still the same thing. And why do I think that's bad? Because those characters already had their spotlight in the original game. We already know how they behave, how Sans is a jokester who can show a more threatening side in the right circumstances. We know how Undyne plays tough, but turns out to be genuinely likable once you get to know her. We know Toriel is kind and caring, and so on. I don't want to watch yet again Alphys nerding out about anime, Papyrus acting goofy, and Metaton being a star, just wrapped in a different visual style. I genuinely don't understand why everyone clings so desperately to the original Core 7, and that's why I started thinking about other series that run into the same problem. I'll use Star Wars as an example, because it illustrates my point perfectly. First, we had the original trilogy, centered around Luke Skywalker and his journey to defeat the Empire. Then came the prequels, focusing on Anakin Skywalker and his gradual fall to the dark side. And then we got, in my opinion, the worst part of the series, the sequels, which were basically a reheated version of the original trilogy. But despite all of that, one concept still made sense. The main characters changed. Trust me, no one would want to watch 9 movies where Luke Skywalker is always the main character. It would get boring. And that's exactly the same problem Undertale Fangames face. I don't want to see another story centered on the classic 7 when we've already seen everything they have to offer. Undertale Fangames can be roughly divided into 2 categories: fangames that try to tie themselves to canon, and AU fangames. We'll start with the first group and then move on to the second one. So how can we make a really good fangame that ties itself to canon? First and foremost, limit the presence of the original 7 as much as possible, really down to the bare minimum. For example, Sans appears briefly in a bar, cracks a single joke, Papyrus walks up, orders his favorite dish, and that's it. Or we could see Bratty and Katie digging through trash with Alphys, with one short, funny exchange. That's enough! The possibilities are endless. Instead of giving them the spotlight again, you can focus on Undertale's background characters, ones that didn't contribute much to the original plot, but could truly shine in the fangame prequel. For example, QC or Burger Pants. And honestly, some fangames already understand this problem really well. That's why I really appreciate how Undertale Yellow handled this. The role of the main 7 is heavily limited. To be precise, only 3 of them actually appear: Toriel, Asgore and Alphys, with the brief mention of Undyne by Moray and a light touch of Metaton in the conversation with Tseroba. I love the fact that these characters were pushed far into the background, making room for entirely new ones. I do wish the FST5 had more screen time, but nothing is perfect. A similar approach seems to be taken by Undertale Kindred Spirits. At least for now, it appears to be heading in the same sensible direction. So far, we've only gotten a roughly 30-minute demo where you escape from Toriel, and everything suggests this story will stay away from the classic 7, and honestly, I really hope it stays that way. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice Toby Fox does the exact same thing in Deltarune. Characters who had massive screen time in Undertale are pushed far into the background. Papyrus, who has more dialogue than anyone in Undertale, even more than the narrator, doesn't appear at all in Deltarune, unless he turns out to be nice, but that's still just a theory. Toriel? Toby had the perfect opportunity to take her into the dark world, let her go on an adventure, and then convince her it was all a dream, just like with Noelle. Instead, Toriel literally slips through the dark world and has no real impact on the story. Azriel, one of the most important characters in Undertale, is at college. Asgore, Alphys, Undyne, Metaton, pillars of Undertale's narrative, are reduced to brief conversations, and Metaton doesn't even appear on screen. Deltarune would not be nearly as successful if the classic 7 had once again received the same amount of screen time as in Undertale. People would have gotten bored. forward. Now let's look at AU fangames, where things get a bit more complicated. In AUs, you can't just remove characters or push them into the background completely, because then the project stops feeling like a fangame and starts looking like a completely separate game loosely inspired by Undertale. These characters need to stay, and their importance should remain similar to the original. So how do you avoid boring the player? The answer is simple. Do what TS Underswap did. You keep the original characters, but add a lot of new ones. Give them real screen time, and don't be afraid to radically change location structure. For example, some AU fangames handle the ruins the same way: an area to walk through, a few puzzles, a couple of fights, and tutorial at the end. Done. TS Underswap does the opposite. At the beginning, you get 3 different paths to progress, and after that, chase sequence. But that's not all. After all of that, you get to explore a massive city full of dialogue and side quests. That's not a cosmetic change, it's a full redesign. Chapter 2 goes even further. In Undertale, Snowdin is basically the kingdom of sands and papyrus, full of their jokes and goofy puzzles. And I'll be honest, at the start of TS Underswap Chapter 2, I was a bit worried it would once again revolve entirely around the skeletons. Thankfully, that changes quickly. Count Coffin K takes us to his castle and dominates most of the screen time, pushing Sands and Papyrus into the background. TS Underswap is a perfect example of how to make an AU fangame genuinely interesting instead of repeating the same thing with a different skin. Now that we've already talking about this, I want to mention a game that could have been much better, but ended up just being okay. I'm talking about Undertale, and to be clear, I'm not here to tear it apart. In fact, I really like how the genocide route significantly diverges from Undertale and how some plot points are presented more clearly. But the problem is, it's still not enough. Undertale can honestly be described as Undertale with a new skin, and no one should be offended by that. The creator clearly wanted players to experience a world like Undertale again, as if it were their first time, just in a cosmic setting, but it doesn't work. While playing Undertale, I often caught myself yawning, because I'd already seen it all. Even though the locations are visually different, their structure and progression follow the exact same template as Undertale. And this is the core of the problem. Even the best technical execution and nice presentation don't mean much if underneath it's still the same thing. However, there is one exception, where reusing key characters actually makes sense. That exception is Delta Traveler. The very idea of throwing Chris, Susie and Noel into the world of Undertale works, and once you add traveling to other games and direct encounters with their main characters, it starts to feel genuinely fresh. Here the form truly carries the message. That's why Delta Traveler is the only real deviation from my original assumption, not because it breaks the rules, but because it does so intelligently.